Welcome to YINZ Podcast. I'm your host, Envy. The other thing about the Down syndrome is I heard the national funding for autism or other special needs is much higher than Down syndrome. Even the government or the government in the top level do not have the awareness that other special conditions have. So they have less or even not any offer from the national government. So, do you think that needs to be improved or some kind of awareness there also?
Yeah, so that's a really great point. I would say absolutely. And there actually has been some growth in that area recently. So, in the last 5 years, there has been new funding that's come through the NIH, the National Institute of Health, specifically to focus on research around the care of people with Down syndrome. $21 million, 21
Wow.
because of obviously Down syndrome and trisomy 21. And that was because of advocacy. Families and self advocates going to Congress and saying, we're important too. But really important story. Once again, when we care appropriately for those with Down syndrome, we actually care for all of us.
Mm.
Um, why is research within the Down syndrome community important? How does it actually impact all of us? Well, obviously, when we care for those within the community, it helps them live more fuller and thriving lives, and they get a chance to really impact us. But also, one of the things that is a challenge in Down syndrome, we know that Alzheimer's disease is very common as those with Down syndrome age. Starting at age 40, and as they age, the proportion of individuals with Down syndrome who develop Alzheimer's is very significant. When we actually think about how do we diagnose and then how do we treat Alzheimer's within this group, we will actually develop the keys to how do we treat Alzheimer's in a global community. And so I think once again, it's a value that when we care for certain people well, it actually trickles down and impacts everybody. So I think it is important for us to think about how do we fund the care of all people.
It's a win situation for advocates in Down syndrome group. So, what other question is what is the main cause for the Down syndrome in first place, especially in the U.S. population or anywhere else? Even though it's like a genetic uh, information change, but what is the root cause? Like, do you have any root cause, if any?
Yeah, that's a great question. So while Down syndrome is a genetic disorder, meaning that it's based on a difference in our genes, meaning that we have an extra 21st chromosome, most of the time, so greater than 95% of the time, it's not necessarily something that is, you know, genetically transmitted from mom and dad in the traditional sense. Meaning that when you have one child with Down syndrome, the chances of you having another child with Down syndrome doesn't go dramatically up. It's not that one parent carries the gene and so that there's a high level of risk every single time. Often what happens is that when our genes are splitting, what typically happens is our cells have 46 chromosomes, and when we're making new cells, those chromosomes split. And when we make sex cells, actually we have the chromosomes split into halves. Sometimes that 21st chromosome hangs on so that usually it's within the egg. That extra 21st chromosome, just by accident, that egg has an extra 21st chromosome. And so when mom and dad's cells come together to make a new person, there's an extra 21st
Mhm.
chromosome. And that is a random event. We know that as people age, meaning the older maternal age you have, the chance of having a child with Down syndrome goes up. That's just because the chance of that error occurring is higher in that age group. Once again, it has nothing to do with what anybody did or any kind of exposure. It's a random event. And so we don't think of it as something that people should worry about that they did something or they had an exposure that led to their child having Down syndrome. It is a unique aspect of who they are that occurs just as the genes are splitting. There is that small group of people, like I said, less than 5%, which have truly what we think of as a genetically motivated form of Down syndrome, something we call a translocation. It's where a parent has one of their chromosomes that actually, instead of being just one chromosome, have two chromosomes stuck together.
Okay.
And that parent carries that in all of their genes. And every time they have a child, there's a higher risk that that child will have that extra 21st chromosome.
Okay. So you're saying like there is no male or female relation to Down syndrome. Like it's only when women of certain age, the chances are more, but there is no specific.
And just to also be clear, like while there is increased probability that you'll have a child with Down syndrome, the older you are, that doesn't mean that younger people can't have Down syndrome. That
So, like, is there any age mark like that like tells us like okay, beyond this age, probably the probability increase 50%, 100%, or something like that?
Yeah, so it's not that high.
Okay.
So we always think that, what you'll notice is that when you're meeting your OBGYN, if you're a woman who's over the age of 35, they may recommend some extra testing to be able to see if your child has Down syndrome. That's just because that's kind of one of the transition points where that possibility goes up. But like I said, I will say that actually more families that are younger have children with Down syndrome than families that are older. And the reason why is that younger people are having more children. And so even though their probability is lower, there's more families out there that are younger that have children with Down syndrome. So once again, I would say it doesn't mean you should be afraid. If you're older and you have a child or you're pregnant, I think it's just good to get all the information you need to be able to make a decision as a family what to do.
Okay. So compared to 25 years or 30 years back, we're getting a better quality of care, and also the life expectancy in Down syndrome increased tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
What are the other significant changes over the past decade?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I would say it's not all healthcare. I think there have been some amazing healthcare changes in that time period that have been really important. So some of the things we can do to treat some of the devastating healthcare problems. So kids who were born with really severe heart disease that may not have been correctable before are correctable now. Some of the kids who were born with digestive problems that may not have been corrected before are corrected now. And that's a huge impactor. But I actually think probably one of the most significant impactors are the way in which we as a society have decided that individuals with Down syndrome, where they should be, where they should live, where they should grow, is with their family and in their community. Historically, if you look at the 80s and before, 1980s and before, often many people with Down syndrome were institutionalized, meaning they were taken out of their homes and they were placed in large institutions and cared for. And that form of care often impacted their health and led to early death. What we can recognize now is that when we give individuals with Down syndrome the right support, be within their family, getting the support they need educationally, addressing their needs as they develop, they often thrive and excel. You're talking about in the 80s, a life expectancy in the 20s, and now a life expectancy, that's a mere 40 years later, is now a life expectancy in the 60s is a dramatic change. And I actually think it's a lot of those community interventions that have been super big impactors and important impactors in the lifespan and the thriving of people with Down syndrome.
Okay. So the real inclusion actually made a difference here.
Yeah.
So, what are the some typical concerns parents express after initial diagnosis, either during pregnancy or after giving birth? We talked about this one, but I specifically wanted to ask because
Yeah.
Yeah, like what kind of questions and what
Yeah.
goes into their mind? And
Yeah, so I would say some of the initial concerns that families have right after receiving a diagnosis of Down syndrome or right after birth is number one, is my baby healthy? That's all of us, right? When anybody holds their child for the first time, the thing they're going to think about is my child healthy? And one of our first goals is to recognize if there are any health challenges that we need as a healthcare community to come around them and support them. That's why when kids are first born, they get an echocardiogram to make sure their heart is safe. We do blood work to make sure that their body is functioning normally. And then we often do hearing tests and vision tests just to make sure everything is going well. And then we support any challenges that are there. The other question that families will often ask me, just like any other family would ask, is what will their future look like? And that's usually what I tell them is this is going to be our journey together. As we get to know each other, my goal is to work with you as a family to recognize any challenges that will arise, and so that we can support you, but also recognize those strengths that our young adults have and our kids have so that we can help them be the best person they can be. I would say one other thing that I will just highlight that's a really important point is that there's something called early intervention. Early intervention is a state funded program that supports our kids in their development. And it starts right at birth all the way to 3 years of age. So while we as a healthcare community are supporting any challenges in their physical body, we also want to think about how are they developing, how are they learning those skills, and it's really important. And we work to connect our families with early intervention so that they can have occupational therapists and physical therapists and speech therapists to support their kids in that first 3 years to develop all the skills that they need.
yeah, that brings our next question. What are the different stages of developmental progress compared to those who do not have this condition?
That's a really great question, and families will ask this all the time. And it's interesting. As pediatricians, you walk to your pediatrician's office, and they're asking you about, oh, are you sitting? Are you walking? Are you crawling? Are you feeding yourself? What kind of grasp are you using? Oh, how many words are you using? All these things, right? They're thinking about what are the different gross motor, fine motor, and speech skills that kids are developing. In what we define as normal, right, is this idea that actually everybody has a different developmental trajectory. Everybody has a little bit of different way in which they are getting to that target. So some kids are walking at 9 months. Some kids are taking their first steps at a year of age. Some kids are taking their first steps at 15 months, right? And what we do is we average those and we say people should be walking at a year of age. So just to highlight, what we define as normal is truly just a bell curve, that it's an average. And what I will tell families is that individuals with Down syndrome, that bell curve is just wider. And so we're going to be looking at the same skills. We want our kids to develop the same skills. It just happens at a different time frame. And I also think it's really, really important not to necessarily compare your child with Down syndrome with another child with Down syndrome, because there can be some variation. In general, most of our kids develop most of their gross motor, fine motor, and speech skills a little bit later. So, for instance, it is not uncommon that if you look at a typical gross motor skill, walking, that our kids may not necessarily develop that skill till
Mm.
2.5, and sometimes 3 years of age. And that's why, as I was talking about before, it's really important for them to get early intervention, getting early exposure with physical therapy to have that extra support to work and develop that skill. But what I would say is that while they develop those skills a little later, we still want to support them to get there. And so I often say, my job is to look and work with you as a family, identify those areas that are the most challenge for you. It may be walking, it may be learning to talk and getting the right supports around you. And we need to individualize that to each of our kids. And so not trying to put a hat on it and make a one size fits all that your kid needs to do this at this age, but rather say, where are you at right now? And how do we get you to that next step?
All resources and contact information you can find in our description of this video.